So let's get started. Okay. Well, hello everyone.
Hello.
First of all, in my mother's language, Ghahate, in my father's language, Ghahate, certainly Shalom, and Assalamu alaikum. You know, language is, for us as human beings, through the eons, has to be very sophisticated. Because if I tell someone to go and get me a rock, well, what kind of rock? Big rock, heavy rock, black rock, square rock, round rock. And so languages are ways in which we as human beings not only communicate with each other, but share with each other. And oftentimes people will say, well, people are given a voice. Black Lives Matter, get a voice. Women get a voice, or they are given a voice. In actuality, when we think about New Mexico, not just as a place, but a place of history, a place of culture, a place of legacy, that we acknowledge a voice. That through language we say who we are. And in my mother's language, before the other side of the world came to this side of the world, there was no such thing as last names. There was no Smiths and Joneses, Garcias, Luceros, Andersons, nothing like that. And how you presented who you were to your group, and if they all spoke your language, it sounds like this. Ghahate hopa, gaita stra stra, sa chamashe, go okay guya, do hinome, John Ghahate, go kumet, sanaya Eleanor, sababa Helen, hinuska sina. That's my mother's language. My father's language is Keshe Hope, Hope Ko Odawakia, Hope John Ghahate, Don Akwi. And so in my mother's language, because we are a matrilineal society, we identify who we are through the women and the mothers of our community. And so what I said to you, first of all, I greeted you, and I greeted you using the word our relatives. Because in a sense, we are all related. We all have the same DNA. That if you wanted some of my blood, I could give it to you. I could share you my heart, my lungs, my kidneys. That's how connected, interconnected we are as human beings. So I greeted you, saying to you, greetings to you, my relatives. I am John Ghahate. I'm from the Pueblo of Laguna. On my mother's side, my mother's Eleanor, my mother's Helen, and our clan is Turkey. And so by going through that process, someone might say, understood what I was saying. Oh, I know who you are, because I know who your mother is. Or I know who your grandmother is. And so language is elemental to who we are as human beings. And once we as human beings then choose to decide how we're going to live, that's called autonomy. We choose to do that. We take that power amongst ourselves to live the way that we choose to live, as compared to sovereignty. Sovereignty requires some other entity to acknowledge that autonomy. So if no other entity, government, kingdom, or whatever overpowers somebody, they do not accept you or acknowledge you as a human being. And through that process, then you enslave one another, you kill one another, you colonize one another. That's why when I talk about the Pueblo Revolt, it's really the fundamental basis of the integral elemental component of it is the choice to choose the way you want to live. That's what the Pueblo Revolt is. And then certainly once the United States becomes the United States, then groups of people said, well, we'll recognize you as a Native American community. And so as a result, when I talk about the Pueblo Revolt, first of all, I kind of move around a little bit. I'm a high school classroom teacher. And so if I stand in one place, I'm sort of like a stationary target. So that's why I move around a little bit. That way I can see who's falling asleep, who's texting on their phone, who hasn't put their phone on mute. Time to do that now. Who's passing little notes for the boyfriend or girlfriend. So that's why I kind of have learned that opportunity to do that. And so that's why I do what I do. And I'm fortunate to have had great opportunities to be a high school classroom teacher, but then also to be the museum cultural educator at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. And so as a result of that, I have been able to develop certain presentations as it applies to who we are as Pueblo people. But the thing about that concept is that when we think about history, history is all of these things here. Because when you think about history and break it apart into the syllables, it's his story. Well, what about my story? What about your story? What about her story? And so when we think about history, it's simply, if it's not inclusive, it's not accurate. If it doesn't ask everybody, then we can never be sure that it's accurate or totally factual. That's what we think about when we prepare this country, the United States of America, prepares for next year, 2026, when everybody will be going gaga, celebrating 250 years as a country. Unfortunately, this side of the world has the evidence to prove that, unfortunately, that's not quite correct. And so this is what I'm going to talk to you about. Certainly, when we think about the Pueblo Revolt, it's important to understand what was at stake. Why did the people choose to take into this action? Why did the people forced to do what they did simply because they got fed up? Or what was at a risk of them losing? And so that's what history tells us as it applies to what we think about history. Whenever we go to a movie, whenever we turn on Netflix or TV, we see these signs. This basically tells us, well, you got to be careful. This is for mature audiences. There's going to be some violence. There's going to be some kind of language maybe you may not necessarily agree with you. So these are things that we see every single day. However, because I do this stuff and begin to help people understand, I've created my own little disclosure, and it looks like this. So if you're not a lifelong learner, I'm sorry, you're going to sit through this presentation. Because what I present to is for lifelong learners. Because you may not know something, but I'm going to help you provide you that. Certainly here, when we think about history, there's going to be violence. That's what people do. This is what human beings have always done. It's their choice to do that. There's going to be talking about sex. Because obviously, where do other human beings come from? Well, they come from sex. You got to think about that. When we think about the violence and the languages are here, there have been multiple languages, and I demonstrated that to you in my opening. But the thing about the Pueblos communities, they have always had all of these different languages, and they're still here. And the language is really elemental to who we are as human beings. There's going to be talk about race, because people have always chosen to see someone else different than the other. There's also going to be talk about religion, because religion helps us kind of realize how connected we are as compared to those other guys over there. Religion helps us do stuff. It validates our actions. It indemnifies what we do. And so religion has always been a part of humankind. The thing about it is that when we think about humankind on this planet, long before religion, human beings became what the anthropologist uses the word cognizant. They began to see who they were as different from another person. They could look in the reflection of water and realize, hey, that's me. That's not someone else. Unless you watch cats or dogs or bears look in the mirror on videos on Facebook where they fight one another, because they realize that that's them. They don't realize that. We as human beings have that ability to do that. And then through time, human beings began to realize, well, what I do about Bob over here who just died. Okay, I don't just leave him there to stink and smell, or let the animals come and chomp on him. I have to learn to do something. And that's when we think about doing things like the afterlife. When we start burying people, mummifying them, cremating them, or choosing some ceremony that we acknowledge who Bob was. That's what human beings have done long before religion. Long before some ideas of dogma and doctrine and tenet, human beings began to realize the importance of life and how we deal with death. And so those are the things we hear. History is going to be a part of this. History and hegemony, how people can choose that it's my right to go do something, my right to invade those guys over there, my right to enslave those guys over there. You know, when I think about hegemony and history, it always reminds me of the movie Jurassic Park. Everybody's seen Jurassic Park, right?
No.
Right? Oh no, but you gotta go watch it tonight, okay? And the part I want you... And the reason why I want you is watch this part where Dr. Ian Malcolm is talking to the scientists. He's saying to them, you guys were so busy thinking about creating dinosaurs, you never thought if you should. But that's the same construct of colonization. That certainly I can do that, I have the might, I have the will, but should I do it? That's the same mentality that I choose to do this thing, to enslave another person, to kill another person, to force them into some construct. because I think it's my way and the only way. And so when we think of hegemony, that's what it means. And the thing about what we think about history is that, unfortunately, we're still living through it today. And certainly CRT, people are afraid of that. We think about critical race theory. But actually, when we think about the pueblos, these, what we now call the state of New Mexico, it really stands for Christian righteousness terrorism. Because someone felt it was their right to tell the Pueblo people, the way you think and do things is wrong. We have the only way to do that. And even there continues to do that today. So these are the things that help you understand that when I talk about history, these are some of the things that are going to be part of that. Overall, these are some of the things to take away from the Pueblo Revolt. Again, the fact that the people who were living here began to live here, and what science helps us understand. I'm a science teacher, so I look at science. And science certainly validates certain things to us, but it doesn't negate or take away from the fact that every culture on this planet has their own stories of who they are, where they come from, where they originate from, their emergence of human beings. The Greeks had Mount Olympus, they came from the gods. Other groups of people came from some other place. Our Navajo neighbors have their stories. Every culture has their story of origin. But when one group says to another group, well, your story kind of sucks and stupid, mine's the only one, and I can back it up by science, then that doesn't validate another person's story. So all of these are part of the story of who the Pueblo people were, how they existed here, and to understand the Pueblo Revolt, it's helpful to understand what was at stake for the groups of people who were here when it applies to why they chose violence to ensure that their existence, which was at stake, had to require some action. That action sometimes in our society today, we can look at it through the courts, we can look at it through the politics of our Constitution, but when we think about long time ago, 400 plus years ago, that was their only choice, and it comes down to violence. Obviously, this is a very poignant statement because we simply think about those who are our leaders, those who we choose to follow, and that's the important part. All this past week, probably on TV, you've heard this yourself, they're saying, well, the only person we can blame for the kinds of economic issues are for the dilemma we're going through for this country is I won't say any names, Donald Trump, but they're saying he's the only person that we can blame. I personally don't believe that because every follower, someone who has supported him, every person who has not challenged him is guilty of allowing that to happen. If we think about what happened during the Holocaust, certainly Hitler was the person who made those decisions, but every follower who did and allowed him to do what he did is accountable. So no one person is innocent, and no one person is guilty. Every follower, every supplicant, every devotee has to bear some responsibility. That's what leadership is. Leadership means that if I choose to take charge of something, unless I have followers, all I'm doing is blowing hot air. I need followers. I need to engage with someone. Help them understand what's inside my brain, pass it on to them, then instill their collective support so that we can accomplish something. That was here at least 1,000 years before 1492, because we know there's evidence of humankind in this Western Hemisphere long before the other side of the world came to this side of the world. One of the things I learned as an educator is that vocabulary is essential, so that if I'm going to help you understand a concept, our language has to make sure that we understand the principle or the content of those words we use. And the reason why I learned that is when I love to teach algebra. I think algebra is probably the most elemental thing we as human beings can learn, because it's not about solving mathematical problems, it's not solving an equation per se. What it is problem solving. how I get from one place to the next place, and if my outcome doesn't result in what my expectations are, at least I can go through my steps and say, oh, that's where I had an issue there. If I had made this particular decision over here, it would have changed the outcome. That's what algebra helps us understand. And that's why when I teach algebra, I want to help my students understand words like equations and properties and variables and constants and all those things that help us understand this thing called algebra. To understand history, these are the terms that I use pretty much all the time. They are elemental for us to help us to understand what history is, as it applies especially to New Mexico. And the thing about New Mexico is New Mexico contributes a lot, not just to the U.S. history, but when you consider it, it's a lot about world history. If you've ever driven up to Los Alamos, you see the layers of strata in the mountains over there. You get down to southern New Mexico, you see the white sands of that national monument. Those were created eons before human beings were ever on this side of this planet. And so when we look at New Mexico, it has a lot to say. The land tells us a story. The land tells us all that is here. So these are words I use to help us understand what New Mexico contributes. All of us who have been to any public schools here in the United States, we all learned that this is history for us. This is history of the United States. This is history of who we are. I was taught this. You were probably taught this too as well. And when I think about my teachers who were teaching me this part of U.S. history, they were simply regurgitating what they were taught. And what they were taught was simply what previous educators taught them. Unless we change that paradigm, unless we change something to say, well, yes, that's true, but there's some other parts missing. And so this is what I hope I can do by providing a little bit of information about the Pueblo Revolt. The reason why I bring up this particular document, it says, we the people. It should have meant everyone, but it didn't. Because only 100 years ago, those of you who have the X gene could not vote. Those of us who were Native American, only up to a little over 100 years ago, we were not U.S. citizens. Those of you who were of a certain color could not own land. So when it says we the people, there should be a little asterisk on it. Probably earlier this week, you probably heard that Harvard University found a document that they spent like less than $25 for, and they realized this is an actual document, okay? It's called the Magna Carta, right? When it says, okay, everybody has this opportunity to have habeas corpus and go before the king. But that's not true. It didn't apply to women. It didn't apply to the serfs. It only applied to the landowner. So when we say, all the people, we should have little asterisks or disclaimers saying, well, we really didn't mean you guys because you're only 3/5 of a person, as it applies to our African American people who live in this country a little over 400 years ago. So this document needs a little bit updating, but who's going to do that? Who's going to take the time to do that to make sure it's inclusive as it applies to actual and factual? Most of us learn stuff like this. It tells us who we are here in the United States. We talk about when the Declaration of Independence was signed. We talk about when Columbus came to this side of the world, when all the things that help us understand. And then we also, as it applies to the entity of this place where you help me, you've invited me to come, we think about when the second temple of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in 7 AD, or it was CE now, it used to be AD, but it's called CE, and then we think about when the United States was founded. However, as I mentioned before, when we think about this side of the world, there's so much more that is important as it applies to humankind on this side of the world. The most important thing is that anybody been to the White Sands National Monument? You've been there? Very good. That's where these were found. These footprints of humankind, we know that at some point in time, there were mammoths and mastodons walking on this planet. Scientists know when the last groups of them were no longer on this planet. But if they were walking along where these human footprints were found, that means human beings have been on this side of the world for more than 20,000 years, rather than simply 5,000 years that was previously prescribed. And because of that, scientists have to add or have to change their understanding of humankind, especially in the Western Hemisphere. Because it didn't start in 1776. It didn't start in 1492. It started long, long before that. A good example of that is when you go to the movies, what do you got to have? Popcorn. But you wouldn't have popcorn unless people were growing popcorn 9,000 years ago. You could not have corn chips, Taco Tuesdays. You could not have your pumpkin pie or your turkeys, because those things were here on this side of the world at least 2,000 years, even before the other side of the world says, oh, wonder what's over there, we're going to check it out. That was what was here on this side. And so to help us at least have an understanding of what the Pueblo Revolt meant to the people who were here and who are still here, it's helpful to understand those things that were here. So these things were here, and science helps us understand that as a way to make sure that we're knowledgeable of that. Many places around here show the evidence of humankind from the earliest groups of people who were living here, perhaps living in caves. This is at Sefardí. They were finding ways to exist in the environment that we're choosing. And when we say exist, it was a little bit difficult because there was no Home Depot, there was no dollar store. They had to go out and find stuff. All the things they needed was simply out their door. There was no such thing as somebody making stuff for you. And all of these things were important to these groups of people because they had to find a way to exist. Scientists help us understand that certain areas had specific abilities to do certain stuff. We look at the pottery, we look at the baskets, we look at the structures of all of those things, and simply currently right now, this is what science understanding of the different civilizations that were here. And all those civilizations existed because of three important things. Human beings need three things. First of all, we need food and water. We can only get by with water for a few days, food for a little bit more. Certainly we need oxygen, but food and water are essential for us as human beings. Next thing we need is shelter. Get out of the rain, out of the sun. Wherever we are, we need shelter. And the last thing we as human beings is we need each other. Because we cannot do everything by ourselves. We need someone to help us along. We need obviously a man or a woman to give us children. And then we need certainly others to help us along. Without those three things, humans could not have existed for as long as they did. And majority of these civilizations that existed here, most of them existed for at least 500 years. And when you consider that, that's twice as long as the United States has been the United States. Simply because of those three things. They had food and water for everybody. They had shelter for everybody. And they understood what it meant to be a community. Without those three things, these civilizations would have existed. And the thing about New Mexico is, we have the evidence. If anybody's ever been to Chaco, anybody who's been to Chaco? Mesa Verde, Canyon de Chelly, Bandelier, Gila Cliff Dwellings, that's evidence. That's why you saw in my list of words, I said ruins. To us as Pueblo people, they're not ruins to us. They are evidence. The evidence of what human beings can do, and through the process of being a community, how they exist. Has anybody ever been here? This is between Phoenix and Tucson, okay? Without community, these people would not have been able to live and reside there. And we prevent further deterioration because it should be a sign to us as to who the people were on this side of the world. And there are many other places that we see. Humankind is always able to help us understand what allows people to do what they do, how to live, how to have community, how to have belief systems, how to share these ideas. All of these things are elemental of a civilization. What it means to live in an environment where I don't have to fear when I go to sleep. I don't have to worry about people taking my stuff, somebody imprisoning me, enslaving me, and killing me. This is what a civil society means. All of these things are elemental. And certainly when one group says that, well, my way is better, then that's what we call colonization. There was governance here. That means I feel as a group of people that we're going to do things together with a certain understanding. This is a community. Because you say, okay, well, we're going to sit here quietly, we're going to listen, and as a result, we all work together. And then when this event is over, when the festival of Sefardí is over, then people are going to put away the chairs. That's what community means. This is what a human society exists and how we live together. When others choose to change that, that's what colonization is. When we talk about agriculture on this side of the world, If you like corn, beans, squash, potatoes, tomatoes, cocoa, tobacco, plantains, chili, avocados, quinoa, pumpkins, peanuts, all of those things only existed on this side of the world. And none of those things grow in the wild. They all have to be cultivated. They all have to be grown in by someone. They have to be planted and then taken care of. The only three things that were not on this side of the world, number one, there was no wheat. Wheat comes from what we used to call Mesopotamia, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan. That's where wheat originates from. There was no cultivated rice. Rice comes from Asia. Now there's rice here in the Western Hemisphere, but it's wild rice. Minnesota, Wisconsin, they have rice. But they don't have to plant it. As long as there's fresh, clean water, it's going to grow. There was no coffee here. Coffee comes from Yemen. That's where coffee comes from. So those three important things were only on the other side of the world. But this is the contribution indigenous peoples gave to the entire world. Because none of these things I mentioned, from corn all the way down to avocados, none of them grow in the wild. They all have to be hybridized. They all have to be grown and eventually cultivated by human beings. So these are the many different things that were here on this side of the world that allowed these groups of people to live and therefore thrive. Obviously, I'm sure some of you have been here. I'm really fortunate to work in Cortez, Colorado. I go here several times a week because we have students that go there, and our goal is to help them understand that for human beings to do this, they need those three things: food and water, shelter, some way to get out of shelter, and each other. Because no one can do this all by themselves. And so if I say to my partner or my brother, say, go get me a rock. Well, again, I have to be specific. Is it a round rock? Is it a heavy rock? Is it a square rock? Is it a flat rock? Language has to become sophisticated so I can convey what's in my 2 ears to someone else. And when we think about tools, especially in the Western Hemisphere, we think about bone tools and wood tools and bone tools. But sometimes scientists don't always think of one important tool. And that tool is that space between our ears, called your brain. Because that's how we communicate and learn to help others understand the ideas in which we have. Because I have to learn how to use those tools so that I can help others. Other things that were on this side of the world, certainly long before the other side of the world came, were these constructs of what it means to be a human society. All of these things did not just pop up when the Pueblo people came here. They were learned knowledge skills. How human beings were here on this side of the world, and through eons of development and progression, they developed all of these things that contributed to the people who were here that we now call Pueblo. Those groups who were here. It's not all of a sudden in 1300 they decided to, poof, build buildings. All of it came from their knowledge from previous predecessors and what we now call our ancestors. One of the unique things about Chaco, I'm sure some of the people have been here, correct? One of the unique things about Chaco, this is Pueblo Bonito. At one point in time, scientists suspect that it was at least 4 to 5 stories high. It had about 800 rooms for this structure here. It's about 2 football fields long on this side. It was begun to be built around the year 800, and by 1250, they know that's probably when the last renovation took place. So people lived here for about 400 years. One of the unique things about Chaco, this is the West Mesa, or East Mesa, apologize, this is the East Mesa, and so this is the west. So this is a picture taken on the sunset with the west over here. So if I stand on the day of the equinox, if I stand right here and watch the sun come up on the east, it lines up with this line over here. 12 hours later, when I go around the other side and stand on this side here and watch the sun go down, it lines up with this line over here. And because I teach geometry, if I make a right angle here, another right angle here, another right angle here, and another right angle here, it creates this line here. This line, if I extend it 2 miles to the top of this mesa, lines up with a structure with the walls on that side of that mesa. And if I extend it 400 miles to the north, it lines up with structures in a place called Chimney Rock in southern Colorado. If I take this same line and line it straight south, this line lines up with Polaris, the North Star. If I take this line and go to 1.5 miles to the other side of the mesa, it lines up with structures on that side of the mesa. And if I extend this line straight south, 800 miles, it lines up with structures in the state of Chihuahua in northern Mexico. So this is what science is. Science allows human beings to observe their environment, and then certainly make some hypotheses, some ideas, guesses of what it means to do. And this is what Chaco has always allowed human beings to do, and it's the iconic example of what civilization existed. And this is long before the Pueblos. So all of this knowledge that the Pueblo people had prior to the groups of people coming to this side of the world was embedded in those groups of people who were here. And that's what is elemental to help us understand a little bit about why the Pueblo revolt was so, to the people then, was necessary. And when I help people understand about the Pueblo revolt and the Pueblo cultures, oftentimes I'm sure you've heard people say, I speak on behalf of this group, I speak on behalf of that group. My perspective is, I speak because of them. Because of my predecessors, I am here. Because of my ancestors, I get to be here. And by speaking my language, by helping people understand about the Pueblo people, I validate their lives. I give authenticity to their lives. Much like many of our Jewish family, friends, neighbors, when they speak their language, when they tell about the Holocaust, they validate all those lives who were lost. Any culture that has that opportunity to do it, sometimes people aren't always accepting of that, but that's why we should work to ensure the languages we speak are spoken. The history that is experienced is told because it validates those who came before us. And this is an example of the things that were here. We know that the people who were at Chaco at some point decided to leave. We're not sure, but we know pretty much when they left, sometime between 1150 and 1225. That's when there was a gradual migration out of this place. And migration is a big word today across this country. How many people are originally from New Mexico? Very good, very good. And the rest, probably migrants, right? Remember those people from Plymouth Rock? Okay, they were the first migrants to this side. Okay, Jamestown, bunch of migrants too. Okay, when we think about migrants, we think about it as a negative term. Let me give you a different perspective. Say you're a person who lives up in Wausau, Wisconsin. You like to fish, you get to canoe, it's kind of cool in the summer times, but then it starts to get cold, the ice gets 4 feet thick. Well, then you decide, well, I don't like it living here, so I'm going to go to my second home in West Palm Beach. So you're not a migrant. What we now use the word is we're calling you a snowbirder. Okay? But you're not hopping around. You're not going from Motel 6 to Motel 6 to Motel 6. You simply have a summer home and you have a winter home. Summer home, winter home. So maybe you're not a migrant. You realize that, it's easier to live in this other place. So that's what perhaps maybe the people who were living here, they chose to live and decide to live. We're not sure exactly why. They didn't give us a lot of information. Maybe somebody didn't like living next to their mother-in-law. Maybe somebody think, the HOA dues are better over there, so I want to go over there. Or maybe my neighbor dissed me, so I don't want to live next to my neighbor. Whatever it was, we just don't know. But we know that they decided to leave. So at about the same time, what we now call our Pueblo communities from along this river, that's about, a half a mile from here, they decided to move here from Taos all the way down to Socorro. This 200-mile-long corridor, people began to live here. We know that was began around 1200, 1250, 1275, because we can check what we call dendrochronology. We can go through and look at the beams of the wood of the vegas and say, this is when this tree was cut down. And so we know that's when people began to live here. And so they began to move here, then they began to become farmers. The thing about being a farmer takes much more brain power than being a hunter. Who loves to hunt? Anybody like to hunt? Some people do. I like to hunt. So if you kill something, you eat that day. Okay? Right? But if you're a farmer, you put something in the ground, it doesn't come up the next day. It doesn't come up the next week. It takes X number of days to get there. So what do you do in the meantime? Play video games, go out cruising. No, you gotta do stuff. You gotta find water, you gotta find food, you gotta find shelter, you gotta take care of this, take care of that, do the honeydews and all this other stuff. So being a farmer takes more planning, takes more process improvement, strategic planning so that what if my plants don't all come through? What if my crop gets eaten? What if the hail comes? What if there's no rain or water? So being a farmer takes more strategic planning and brain power rather than simply being a hunter. Certainly hunting is good, you got to do stuff, but at the same time, being a farmer takes all of these things for us to exist as a society. And think about it, of all the movies you watch, they don't make movies about farming. Farmers are kind of dull, boring, but they talk about action, bombs exploding and stuff. Those are the people that really, really think about it. But being a farmer, these are the things that allow someone to be a farmer, to understand what it means to exist as a society, to be able to provide all the things that help them understand as a society what it's going to take for me to endure all the things. So this is one of the interpretations of what scientists think that the Chakwan culture contributes to the entire Southwest, the Four Corners region. It's a 500-mile radius all around here, and the influence that we see, and eventually coming down and living along this river we now call the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande is the fourth longest river here in North America. It starts up there in northern Colorado, comes all the way through New Mexico, currently forms the border between Mexico and the United States. That's what allowed these groups of people who were living in this region from around the year 800 finally to around the year 1200 when they decided to gradually move out of this area and find these kind of structures that we still see today. Santa Ana, Santo Domingo, Cochiti, and all the other places that are here. As a society, these are the things, these are the elemental things of what it means to be a society. As human beings, we as human beings need these things to exist as a community. Certainly we need community centers, what holds us together, our families, our relatives, all the things that connects us. And then through that we have our culture, we have ceremonies, we have celebrations, we have dances, we do the things that all human beings do. And then certainly we incorporate science principles, certain things that for us to do. For us to be a scientist, to be a farmer, we use photosynthesis. To us to build buildings, we use physics. To all of those things that are elemental, we could not do anything without science. But what holds all of this thing together is corn. That's why when we celebrate and acknowledge the importance of the gift of corn to us as a society, because without corn, we would not have existed for our Pueblo ancestors who were residing in this place. Pre-contact means that before those groups of people from the other side of the world came to this side of the world, what was here? It's interesting to understand, Spain did not become a country until 1779. So when we say the word Spaniards, it's really not accurate. They were representatives of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. If you ever watched the movie, the first Gladiator movie, they called the main character a Spaniard. Well, that was not even a word in Rome at the time. It was Hispania at the time. But Spain as a word really didn't come into play until late 1700. Although we say they're Spaniards who came here, they were not actual Spaniards because they were not Spain per se, but they were representatives of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, they were the representatives. And all of these things were in existence along this river that we now call the Rio Grande. South of Albuquerque, we don't have, other than Isleta, we don't have any other Pueblo communities. But places like Belen, Los Lunas, Tehique, Chilali, Abu, Socorro, those were pueblos. And it's estimated that by the time the representatives of the Spanish crown came to this region, there were probably anywhere from 6 to 80 different distinct communities along this river. Now there are 19. But there were so many other pueblos that were communities that were here. It's estimated that Socorro had 4. Here in Albuquerque, there was probably 4 or possibly even 5, because it was a big flat plain here. If you drive up to Santa Fe, you come to Algodones. Algodones was a pueblo. Berlin was a pueblo. Bernalillo was a pueblo. Tehique, Chilali was a pueblo. Up North 14, you come to Madrid, La Cienega. Those were pueblos. So there were so many more pueblos, not just the current 19 that we think of as it applies to these pueblo people. When I told you about what it instills to then conquer another group, what changes for the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon and the Kingdom of Italy is that the Pope begins to issue executive orders. Excuse me, not executive orders. Edicts. I'm thinking of somebody else. We call these papal bulls. Basically by some decision, not by someone saying and contributing to a decision or legislation, but somebody saying, we're just going to do this. Certainly humankind has always encroached on others. The Phoenicians did it, the Babylonians did it, the Romans did it. But what changes in the 1500s is now the Catholic Church indemnifies it, indemnifies slavery, indemnifies colonization, indemnifies terrorism, simply because I can do this to another group, but now I can ask forgiveness for it. I can go through the rosary and say, this is what I did, and forgive me, Father, for this is what I did. So in the 1500s, what changes for the Catholic Church is now I can do stuff, bad stuff, but now I can be forgiven for it. That's what changes in the 1500s, by these things we call papal bulls, by a certain edict that was existed, that we could do stuff, that we want to throw the Jews out of the kingdom of Castile and Aragon, that nobody who is worthy of the Catholic faith can be persecuted, burned at the stake, and tortured. That's what changes in the 1500s. We call that the Spanish Inquisition. That people were certainly changed, and this was supported by the Catholic Church. So these are papal bulls that were elemental and instrumental to how the church and state become one. The church indemnifies the state, and the state simply is a mechanism to ensure what the church wants to do. This is what papal bulls are, and the earliest ones come around the year 1200, and they exist almost to the year 1800, when they no longer become part of the kingdom, or the state, or the country of Spain. So these are what we call papal bulls. What we do know again about the Pueblo people is where they came. They came along this river, what we now call the Rio Grande. We know where they came, from Taos all the way down to Socorro. They decided to live there. They were farmers. They were not warriors. They didn't have horses. And that's mentioned another thing. Here on this side of the world, there was no large domesticated mammal in this region. There was no horses, cows, pigs, sheep, goats, nothing like that, donkeys or camels. There was nothing that was domesticated that gave somebody a better advantage over another group. So if you wanted to kind of cause issues for those guys over there, the only two things you had were these two things. So you just had to run faster than the other guy, because nothing gave you a better advantage. What changes is when the representatives of the kingdom of Castile and Aragon, they bring horses. So you see the horses around Placitas and the other places throughout New Mexico, those came with the representatives of the Spanish crown, simply because there was nothing on this side of it. Now, there was wild goats and wild sheep, but they had not yet been domesticated. The only things that were domesticated on this side were dogs and turkeys. So the next time on Thanksgiving you appreciate turkeys, say thank you Native Americans for that. Simply because. And they had acquired certain knowledge to be the kinds of societies and civilizations that they existed as. Certainly here in New Mexico, this is what we're taught about the first groups of representatives of the Spanish crown who come to this region, what we now call the state of New Mexico. Unfortunately, that's not quite true. First of all, Coronado, I guess the best way to explain it is, say you wanted to go to Europe or Israel, and you wanted to live there, but you know that, well, do I have a job, do I have money? For you to do that, you have to sell all the things you have, cash in your 401k, sell your car, sell your home, so you have money so you can exist in another country. Well, when Coronado decided to do that, that's what he had to do. Because the king chose not to pay for anything. He had to pay all the people, he had to buy all the supplies, he had to buy all the horses, the food, and he had to buy all this stuff in preparation that I'm going to go up there, I'm going to find all these riches and stuff, I'm going to find a way to China, I'm going to do all this stuff. Obviously, that didn't turn out the way he had planned, so when he got back to what we now call Mexico, he was pretty poor. But he had invested all of that so he could do that. He was still very much under the impression is any day now, if I walk over the next hill, over the next valley, I'm going to hear someone speaking Cantonese or Chinese any day now. That was still his impression until about 5 years later, this guy, Magellan, finally says, hey, there's a big ocean out here. It's much bigger than we even thought. So that was still this impression that these groups of people had. But the first person to actually come to this side of the world was not from Europe, was not a white person, was not a Christian, he was from what we now call Morocco. He was a Muslim. He was from the group of people who live in a place we now call Morocco. Those indigenous peoples who live in Morocco are not Moors, or what the Spanish and the Romans called them Moors. They were Amazian, the indigenous peoples of what we now call Morocco. He was captured by a Spanish nobleman in 1526. They lived in Spain, or the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, up in 1527. They sailed to Hispaniola. We now call that the Dominican Republic in Haiti. They caught up in a ship that was going to sail to the western coast of Florida. Anybody from Florida by any chance? Anybody from Tampa Bay? Okay. They sailed to Florida, and they were caught up in a hurricane, and they got shipwrecked just a little bit north of where Tampa Bay is now. So they all get washed up ashore. There's about 300 souls of them. And they figure out, well, someone's going to come and rescue us, but no one does. So they decide to walk back to where they think they came from, which is about a long way. So they set out nevertheless. So they go up the panhandle of Florida, into Alabama, into what is now Alabama, Mississippi, and they go into what we now call Louisiana. Now, I've never physically been to the shores of Louisiana, but I understand it's not a nice place to be walking around. There's a lot of swamps and critters, gators, water moccasins and stuff. So people are dying along the way, but they continue walking. They go through Texas. They come through the very southern part of New Mexico. Someone decides, well, maybe we should head south. And someone finds them 8 years later on the western coast of what we now call Mexico. And of those 300 souls that got washed ashore in Florida 8 years later, there's only 4 of them left. And one of them is this slave who was captured in Morocco in 1526. His name was Esteban, or Estebanico. And along the way, they find that there was other people living up here. So when he's interviewed by the viceroy of New Spain, his name was Mendoza, he says, hey, there's a lot of people up there. They have buildings, they're farmers. We should go check it out. So in June of 1539, Esteban and a priest whose name was Fray Marcos de Niza, they come to the Pueblo Zuni. Unfortunately, he starts doing stupid stuff like other human beings do, demanding food and water and women and gold. Well, the people didn't want to do that, so unfortunately they kill him. The priest returns back to Mexico and says, well, I think there's a lot of stuff where we're going to go check it out. So that really brings up the next person that we now know as Coronado, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. So the first person to come into what we now call New Mexico is not an actual Spaniard. He's a North African. He's not a black African, but he's North African. He was Muslim, and he was not a white person. And so that's what we should be told when we think about what New Mexico is. Lastly, when we think about the word Pueblo, it's really not our word. Certainly, I've said it a number of times already, because when I speak English, then I say the word Pueblo. The word Pueblo actually comes from a Latin word, populos, which means people, or sometimes can mean town as well. It eventually evolves into the word Pueblo, which means town. So when the first groups of representatives of the Spanish crown were coming here, they might be saying, "Los pueblos allí." Oh, there's some towns over there. La puebla aquí. There's a town over here. So that term began to apply to the towns and the communities that were here. Eventually, what happens is different compared to the other groups that were many different indigenous peoples living around in this area. Our Dene, Navajo neighbors, Comanches, Utes, Paiutes, Tarahumara, Yaqui, Chichimecas. So there were many other groups of people living in this area, but they were not living like these groups that we now call pueblos. They were living in multiple storage structures. Anybody ever been to Taos or Acoma? That's what they were living like at that time. They were farmers. Okay, they didn't just go out gathering stuff. All their subsistence existed for them as farmers. So the Spanish began to think of them, well, you know, guys, they're different from those guys. They're not barbarians. They're not savages. They're civilized groups of human beings. And two things happened for the groups of representatives of the Spanish crown when they came here, and they decided to do two important things. They saw the way they lived, and I'm sure some of you have been to Europe before, right? If you go to Rome, if you go to Paris, you go to England or London, most people who live in the city, they live in apartments. No one has their own little individual single home like we do here in the States, okay? Well, that's how people lived a long time ago. A community, big housing complexes, public housing maybe, sort of communal living. And so this is what people live. This is one of the earliest pictures of Zuni, taken in the late 1800s. And so that's what they found when they came here. This is sort of one of the earliest maps of this area, drawn by representatives of the Spanish crown. And so there are many, many more. Each of these places had their own name. Like we now call this Santo Domingo. We say it's Kimo. Acoma, that's where the word Acoma comes from. The word in the language that the people at Acoma speak, Caris, the place is called Haku. That's the name of the place. But who they are as people, they say Agume. That's where the word Acoma comes from. In Zuni, there's three main places: Halona, Hamiku, and Kopacha. These places are here. We call ourselves as human beings Ashui. So that's who I am as a person, is Ashui. The place where we live is called Halona Itemona. That's the name of the place where we live. But when we say Ashui, maybe the Spanish said, I don't know what you're saying. It sounds like Zuni to us. So whatever, we'll just call you Zuni. And the same way with other places here. We have these places here that we see other places like. And then once they begin to do one important thing, they begin to call them, dependent upon the saints that were given amongst the groups of people who were here. So this is, how can you understand why the Pueblo people, oops, I put the slide in one spot. I'm going to go back. I'm going to go ahead again, go back. Oops. Uh-oh, what happened here?
Nope.
Oh, I don't want to go back. Is this one? Oh. Go ahead, advance it. Can you advance it?
Next one.
There we go, one more time. Okay. So the colonial period includes this. One of the important things about the colonial period is this word, encomienda. And it's like the European feudal system. And the feudal system, remember I talked about the Magna Carta? The feudal system was basically what an agreement between the landowner and the serfs, the people that were owning the land. The difference for the representatives of the Spanish crown was the encomienda. Certainly the landowner could tax and force people to give tribute. But one of the things that the landowner, the encomendero, was responsible for was for the Christianization of the people. And when you say that, you have to accept one important premise. Because at the same time, on the other side of the road, remember I talked about that Spanish Inquisition? If you're not seen worthy of the Catholic faith, you can simply be killed, persecuted, and enslaved. But if you're worthy of the Catholic faith, first of all, you have to be a human being. Because all human beings have souls. You don't Christianize cats or dogs, trees or rocks. Only human beings. And so for the representative of the Spanish crown, they began to do two important things. First of all, they worked to force the people who were living here. Well, this is San Gabriel, the first capital of what we now call Nuevo Mexico. That's up in Okewenge. What they did, first of all, they began to acknowledge the land. I'm sure some of you have heard this thing called land grants. Land grants are very important here in New Mexico. Simply because the Spanish said, okay, well, you guys are over there, and you guys are over there, but let's do something, let's measure it out. So what they did is they measured a league in all four cardinal directions, and a league at the time was about 5,000 varas, which is a special cane that the king had measured out. So you laid the cane 5,000 times as one league. That was the league at the time. And so from the church that they built, they measured one league in all four cardinal directions. Just north of here, you have another land grant, Elen Gallegos. Who's ever been up to Taos? Anybody? I'm sure people have been up to Taos, right? First sign you see, it says you're entering the Cristobal de la Sierra land grant. Land grants were simply ways that the Spanish said, okay, yeah, we're here, we're going to be the landowners, but you guys stay over there, and you guys stay over there. Those land grants are still very prevalent today. Some of you who maybe have been here since the 60s or 70s, you might know this guy by the name of Reyes Lopez Terrina, up in Chama. Okay? Land grants. When the government decides to say, well, we're refuse your cattle to go into your own land grant, then there were some issues, and a sheriff was killed, FBI agent was wounded. Because those land grants stem back to long before the United States was the United States, simply because they acknowledged something. And let me talk about acknowledgement. Oftentimes, this past week, 2 weeks ago, this person, again, which I will not name names, Donald Trump signed this executive order saying that we're going to bring back Columbus Day. Okay? And we're going to, not anybody can do Indigenous Peoples Day. And let me talk to you about this word, discovery. Okay? Discovery means all of a sudden I find something. Okay? So when you all leave, get ready to leave here, would you please leave your car keys and your wallets in your chair, and I'm going to come by and discover them. Because when I say the word discovery, it means or implies that it can be mine now. That's what 1492 implies. That simply because I found something, I can change, I can have access to it. But say you leave your wallet or your car keys on your drop-it, and I pick it up and says, excuse me, here's your car keys. First of all, I acknowledge the fact that it's yours. Acknowledgement and discovery are two different constructs. But that's what is taught when we talk about Columbus. It means that I can do stuff simply because of my mentality or my choice of ideas. And then when the Catholic Church comes about, it indemnifies my right to do that. So this is what the Spanish or the representatives of the Spanish crown, they begin to acknowledge the lands of the Pueblo people here. They acknowledge the lands, and when you put it out into a league and do all the algebra to it, it comes out to that much of acres that the Spanish crown acknowledged, saying, okay, you guys are over there, all our colonists have been over here. And also part of being in the encomendero or the encomienda, the policy the Spanish crown offered to colonists who came with Oñate was that if you come here for 5 years, you stay here and build a community, that land that I acknowledge for you is yours and your family into perpetuity. You can collect taxes and tribute from the slaves or the Pueblo people that you bring into your encomendero. And you can also get a very tiny little title called a hidalgo. Those were the perks that someone who came as a colonist to Nuevo New Mexico, that if I measure out the land, that's yours, and you can do all these things. So these are what we call the land grants, which are still very prevalent today. So important today that in 1970, President Reagan returned Blue Lake back to the public house. In 2016, President Obama returned that western side of that mountain back to the Pueblo Sandia. Because it stems from this, the agreement between a sovereign, the kingdom of Castile and Aragon, and the Pueblo people of here. Those are valid. They're not treaties. That's the difference between a treaty and a relationship of acknowledgement. Treaties are easily broken. Obviously, we see that. But this is the difference between, this is what we call the Foursquare League of the people who were living here and existed here long before the United States becomes the United States. I'm sure everybody, some of you have been here, right? See this church right here? That church was begun to be built by the the Pueblo people were forced to build that church as early as 1602. That's 5 years before Jamestown, and 15 years even before the Pilgrims get to Massachusetts. They were building churches and then forcing them to go to those churches. And so, like I said, you don't force cats or dogs to accept Christianity or religion. Only human beings, because only human beings have souls. And so it's through that acknowledgement that the representatives of the Spanish crown saw those groups of people that we now refer to as Pueblo, simply because they saw them as human beings, as societies. So these are all the things that were, at risk for the people who were referred to as Pueblos. Another thing that they did, they acknowledged the leadership. These are the canes that currently all our governors have. One cane comes from the King of Spain, this one right here. You can see the king's emblem right there. That comes as early as 1620. Another cane comes from the Emperor of Mexico, I'm sorry, no. The second king comes from the United States. No. Yeah, oh yeah, the Emperor of Mexico first. When Mexico wins its independence from Spain, Spain and Mexico agreed that the same provisions of land acknowledgement are still valid. So the Emperor of Mexico gives the Pueblo leaders a cane. The third cane comes from the United States when the United States signs the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1846, and Congress ratifies that and then acknowledges the land ownership by the Pueblo people and authorizes President Lincoln to give them another cane. That's called the Lincoln cane, and it's dated 1863 with Abraham Lincoln's signature on it. And the fourth cane comes from the Kingdom of Spain in 1992, 500 years after Columbus, to say, well, we kind of screwed up, our bad, and we acknowledge that. So these four canes are held by the Pueblo governors. On January 6th, not the one that occurred 3 years ago, because on January 6th, there's something in the Catholic calendar called King's Day, or the Day of Epiphany. It's the day that the three kings came to Bethlehem to acknowledge this little baby that is the epitome of God. That somebody says, oh, I get it now. This is the epitome, God is in that little baby. What the King's Day for the Pueblo people is that the Spanish acknowledge the right of the people who were here as human beings, the right to govern themselves, the right to exist as a society, and therefore we're going to acknowledge these lands. So when our Pueblo people transition from one government administration to the next, they physically give these canes because it's an acknowledgement of the leadership of our Pueblo communities. We acknowledge that, as compared to someone who refused to do that several years ago. Acknowledge the fact that there's a transition, there's that leadership idea. These are the things that hold our communities together, even in the year 2025. So in the year 1680, all of these things were at risk. All of these things were, if there was nothing to prevent them from doing something, we would not be here as Pueblo people. The languages would be gone. The foods would be gone. The art and every component of their society would be gone. All of these things were contributing to why the Pueblo revolt ended up the way it did. That there was violence on both sides, that people had to do something about it. And the challenges that existed for Popeye was, number one, he spoke one language. We don't know that he spoke more. But like I said, there were 7 different languages spoken amongst these groups. Then another law that the Spanish imposed was that no Pueblo person could own a horse or ride a horse. So you had to give all this information to somebody and then transfer it to all the other groups. And another thing that existed was when the Spanish who were here began to establish churches in all of these communities, and perhaps some of you have been to some of our feast days, right? You go to our feast days, it begins with Catholic Mass. And then they bring the patron saint out and parade it through the community. Well, in addition to what they did is they established individuals in the community that were sort of like ombudsmen. Maybe there's this relationship person that would be in relationship to the community and the Pueblo and the Spanish authorities. But a better word for that is that they were snitches. They would tell other neighbors, oh, you didn't go to Mass, or you didn't do this, or you're dancing the dances you're not supposed to be doing. So these individuals had been doing this for some 80 plus years. So when the Pueblo revolt occurred, those people who had been telling on their neighbors were probably thinking, it's not a good idea for me to be sitting around here because they're killing the priests, they're killing the soldiers. And so as a result of that, some of them decided to leave when the Spanish decided to leave as they're coming down I-25. No, they're just coming down the river, down towards Socorro. But at the same time, the Spanish, as they were leaving, they were afraid they'd be attacked again. And so they took human hostages. And so they went all the way down to a place where we now call El Paso, Texas. The actual place of that region, what we now call El Paso, Texas, in Spanish is called El Paso del Norte. And the reason why it was called that is because it was, at that time, the river was the widest, and therefore the most shallow. And so that was an easy place to cross. Those people that were taken or or went voluntarily were just dropped off there. And they stayed there. And they continue to be there. 12 years later, when they decided to come back, we know two things. Number one, that they also knew that there was not that really their home. Also, Dr. Joe Sando mentions in his book, and also I have this book here. This is my resource here. And I have several books in the back if anybody's interested, I have for sale. But Dr. Sando mentions that there was a delegation of Pueblo leaders that went into Mexico to begin some dialogue with the Spanish. Because all of those things that had been happening before the Pueblo Revolt were occurring here. There was a drought going on, there was incursion by other groups because they were hungry too, that there was a gradual splitting of this support system that allowed the Pueblo Revolt to occur. And the way Dr. Sando describes it is that there was a slight difference of opinion between those who were the much older Pueblo members. They literally wanted to get rid of everything. They wanted to kill all the horses and cows and burn the wheat fields, literally just wipe everything clean. But then the other younger groups were thinking, it's kind of, I don't have to carry everything on my back now. I have a donkey, I have a horse, I have a wagon, I have metal tools. And some of them were certainly really bought into the Christian faith, so they were practicing clandestinely. So there was a kind of a budding of these societies that were existing. And so as a result of this conflict going on, there was a delegation of Pueblo leaders who went down to Mexico and kind of said, you guys were kind of rude last time. Would you consider coming back up? So they did that in 1692. So they're coming to where those people had left off in what we now call El Paso. And so they're saying, well, we're going to go back up. Some of you are welcome to come up along with us, but you got to walk. You don't have horses for you. And so some of them were thinking, well, this is really not our home. We should go back to where we come from. And some of the others were saying, it's a long way up there. I got to walk all the way. I just planted my garden. I just made an addition to my house. I just got a new subscription to Netflix. Now you're telling me to go all the way back up. So some of them stayed. And so if you Google map the city of El Paso, you see the outline of the city of El Paso, and right in the middle of the city of El Paso is the Pueblo Isleta del Sur. Those are the group of people that were taken and left with the Spanish in 1680, and they've resided there. That's why they are a legitimate Pueblo community right in the middle of this, what we now call the city of El Paso. So that's really what was at stake when we think about the Pueblo Revolt. The Pueblo Revolt was a voice of autonomy. The right to be here, the right to ensure that what my ancestors contributed to me as a society, as a person, was not lost simply because someone chose to come to this side of the road and change everything for us. And so this person, Pope, had the insight to do all those things and began to work to ensure that the legacy of the people who had been here for 400 plus years was still here. That's the same thing that goes on 800 years since this event occurred. That we are still here as Pueblo people, our culture, our languages that we share with you when you go to our feast days. When we share the things at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center, the artwork, the food, the languages, everything is part of this culture. And certainly we think about our neighbors throughout the entire region, that when we think about what history is for New Mexico, it's not just since human beings have been here. It's more than that. And when we consider as a country next year in 2026, when fireworks and flags are going off, and we're thinking, the United States is kind of the best. Well, it hasn't always been the best. Simply because we're not willing to look at history as it applies to specifically what New Mexico contributes. Many of us have been probably to Arizona, Utah, and Colorado. None of those three states have pueblos, only here. And we're fortunate enough because of that river. That river gives us life. That river provides us all the existence for us to be here and all the things that contribute to us as society. This is the reason why this statue of Pope stands in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. It's an acclamation and a validation of the Pueblo people. that we are still here today. Certainly we share this place with our neighbors, our Hispanic neighbors. We talked about our Jewish neighbors who were forced to come here because they were trying to escape the Spanish Inquisition. And we know that from other authors that they were simply trying to get out of being forced to tell on their neighbors, being forced to undergo torture, that they were being forced to accept Christianity even though they were questioned about it, and they were called conversos or pretend Christians. That this thing we call New Mexico has always been diverse, has always been made up of different belief systems, has always been a collective of communities. And when people will say, well, we should all speak American, unfortunately that's too late because languages have always been here. We speak many, many languages and we will continue to do so. That is our right. That's what autonomy means. And so when we think about what the Public Revolt was, it was the right to do the things that were elemental to us as a group of human beings. And we share that with others. We share that with our Jewish neighbors, our Muslim neighbors, our Hispanic and Catholic neighbors. That's what being a public culture means. And we want to ensure that it's not going to be lost. And as we become more educated, hopefully we can find ways to do that with some degree of civility and logic. But the problem is that some of our fellow neighbors have different ideas. They choose to have a certain approach to what history is. They choose to follow someone who is really saying what they've been feeling all along. They've always had these attitudes, but now you have something in high office who spouts this rhetoric. Now they have someone who they can stand behind. Unless we change that paradigm, unless we are willing to stand up, and sometimes under duress, and sometimes under ridicule, that we will not allow history to be told the way history is. That's what the Public Revolt means to us. Simply because there are some of our fellow citizens who choose to not acknowledge the fact that we never learn from history. We do not take the time to learn that sometimes history can be very skewed. But if we're willing to be courageous, like the Pueblo people in the Pueblo Revolt, even though it meant possibly a death and harm, that they will certainly work to accomplish that. So that's, for me, the Public Revolt is really more than just a war, a conflict, that it's really your human right to be a human being, to take charge of all the things that your predecessors gave you. They gave us life. Our parents gave us life, gave us language, knowledge, but their parents gave them the same thing, and their parents gave them the same thing. That's what it means for us as Pueblo people, and we take that challenge literally to ensure those things exist. And every group of human beings have that right. Lastly, I know there's a lot of things going on in this world. Our leaders are making those decisions, such as in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Yemen, in Chile, in Peru, in Guatemala, in Thailand. But it's the leaders who make those decisions. But we as the populace, we of the community, we have to make a choice on who we choose. And like I said, no one is the only person held responsible. The followers contribute to that. So again, thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. Wow. I have some books. This book up here written by Dr. Joseph Sando and Herman Aboyle from Okewenge. Dr. Sando is from the Pueblo of Jemez. Also, it tells you a little bit about the emphasis of what the Pueblo Revolt is. So the back, $20 cash, or if you want to pay a square, it's 21 something. So anybody have any questions? How can that help? If not, thank you again.
Thank you.